Welcome to this session on the translation of poetry. I think Meena has to leave a little early, and so before that, she wants a book to be released here. Well, it's a very tricky kind of question that we are going to try to answer. Is poetry translatable at all? And this question has been asked time and again. And it was with trepidation that many of us came into this act of translating poetry. Because from our childhood, we have heard that poetry is something that is impossible to translate, or poetry is that which cannot be translated. I remember quite a few of those sayings, like negative statements about the translation of poetry. Poetry is that which is lost in translation is a very well-known saying by Robert Graves. And it is an attempt to solve an insoluble problem. Again, Humboldt. Translation offers only a vague equivalent, none other than Virginia Woolf. Translation is the art of failure, none other than the great linguist Umberto Eco. Translators are traitors. It's a well-known, or notorious Italian proverb. So there are so many statements about the impossibility of translation, particularly of poetry. And so we are here trying to explore the meaning of all these statements and why still people keep translating poetry. Always, even many of those who made these statements have translated poetry. And what is it that drives them to the translation of poetry? What is it that motivates them? And what's the kind of poetry that they choose to translate? What is their own concept of translation of poetry itself? And what is the relationship with the target language, or the relationship between the original language and the target language? Is there an original text at all? As Roland Barthes and later theoreticians would say, there is no original text at all. So that gives the translator a lot of freedom, that you don't have an original text, because every text is polyphonic. It has many voices, and the translator can choose the kind of voice that he or she wants to hear in that particular text. So there have been discussions on, because translation theory has been one of my areas of specialization. So I'm not going into deep theory here, but we are just dealing with some of the primary questions about the translation of poetry. As an introduction to that, Anwar asked me to read a poem which I had written long ago on translating poetry, which again has something to do with this whole question of the impossibility of translating poetry. Translating poetry. Of course, this was again a translation I made from my own Malayalam original. Poetry translation is a transmigration. As a fish dives through water, the translator moves through minds. On the brink of each word, on the bank of each word, in the thick sand, he kneels, studying the color of each shell, blowing each conch. Poetry translation is the embarrassing head transposal of the Vikramaditya tales. The translator supports another poet's head on his, could be her, on his or her trunk. Each line is a lane worn out with war, misery, and boredom. A bylane of music along which parade immortal men, gods, and trees. An abyss opens where a line ends. The souls of the dead quench their thirst in the pool of silence. Oh, those who come this way, please take off your shoes and leave your garments here. You must sneak through naked like the wind in the valley. One day, I dreamt of myself translating my poetry into my own language. All of us translate each poem into our own private language, and then we quarrel over the meanings. It seems to me that the Babel never be complete. So it's again about the about the near impossibility of translation. And it should sound ironic that I have translated about 3,000 pages of poetry from across the world, in spite of my suspicions about the possibility of translation. And all of us have been in some way translators from one language or the other. And so we are not unfamiliar with the essential questions that every translator has to face in this, encountering this terrible, difficult, challenging process of translation. So I would like to ask each of them the first question: what is your idea of translation? Can I start from Meena?
Thanks, Satchimash. I am very happy to be on this panel with people I've worked with before. I met Zoë 10 years ago, 12 years ago at a poetry workshop. So I think translation is a very broad field to comment, but I very particularly feel some things when I translate poetry, which is very different from translating, let's say, prose or political writing. And I think in poetry, whether it's, classical poetry like Tirukkural from 2000 years ago, or present poetry, is that sometimes the punch has to land, you cannot do glossing, like you cannot go and start explaining. So for me, I've always felt that you have to be so true. And also, when you're a poet yourself, you always want to, you have this feeling, you feel very jealous as well, like, okay, I'm not going to make this like my poem because I am a different person, they are a different person. At the same time, you have like, how do you keep yourself away? How do you keep your instincts away and still do the best job? So that, like when I translate Salma, it sounds like Salma. When I translate Malati Maitri, it sounds like Malati Maitri, writing in the English. When I translate Thiruvalluvar, it translates. And I think in that sense, you have to, for at least some time, enter another person's life or shoes, or at least think you are entering that space of their relationship with language, what exists for them. I think you try to capture that. And the second thing I have felt about translation is that in some way we are all still fighting against this flattening of the world into some kind of Anglophone normative order. At some point I'll read a poem, because when we look at colors, right, like even like 200 years ago, like Tamil had this very specific words for light, let's say light green or dark green, or, how do we call red? How do we call gray? Like there's no word for gray, right? Gray was always called ash colored. So how did, and one of the ways in which, not just translation, but in which the permeation of English has sort of gone into a language is that we have stopped with the very necessity English categorization of words. And we have lost, and I think that's just one of those lexical losses that I feel that, because I don't, as a person, I don't have much to complain about English. It's still one of the most flexible languages. It's one of the languages that lets you, because of its ability and the fact that it contains so many other languages because of its history. But at sometimes I feel that in some ways, many things have disappeared from our own conception of our own universe. And I think that for me is what I often face as a translator. So.
Hello, my name is Juana Adcock. I'm from Mexico, and I'm very glad to be here. I've been involved with translating some poets from the indigenous languages of Mexico, not just Spanish, and bringing them into English. So I often ask myself this question as well about the impossibility of translation. And I think if translation is impossible, then surely our tasks as translators is to be miracle workers, right? And I think I really admire, for example, the kind of work that you do where you're bringing something that to me would be entirely unknown, entirely foreign, from another era, from another culture that I have no knowledge about, but somehow you manage to bring it into my present and to make it something that I can strongly relate to. And I think that as translators, this is kind of our work as well. So being that kind of bridge or a medium, and to me it's a kind of almost spiritual practice as well, where it's about me getting out of the way and allowing the message to kind of come through to me and bridge it over to the other person. So yes, and like I had, for example, when translating a poet from the Mexican indigenous language Mepa, we have this difference, like certain words have very strong associations with his culture. When he talks about a particular kind of stone, that stone has an entire history, an entire mythology, an entire different weight than it does in the English language. And so then how do I bring that in to the reader, the Anglophone reader, and how do I allow them to relate to that? And that's definitely the challenge. And I think also I have the luck that I'm able to work closely with the poet himself and ask him these questions and learn more about his culture so that I can then convey it in a way that isn't academic with thousands of footnotes and you know, making it like just unrelatable, but somehow making it come alive. And I think that's the art, and I think it's something that has to be bigger than me. It can't be me saying like, oh, I'm, like you were saying, like, this is my poem. No, you have to kind of get out of the way and allow it to speak through you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Zoë Skoulding, and I'm really delighted to be on this panel and with Meena, because we worked together a long time ago, but also more recently, there's some of Meena's work in an anthology that I have co-edited called Poetry's Geographies. And in fact, it's part of the book that you're about to launch in the next event. So, the amazing thing about Meena's translation, as an example, is it's taking something historical, but really looking at it through a very critical lens, in a kind of rewriting that puts that sort of centers a woman's perspective in quite a different way. And so it really does something in terms of its present moment. And so that relationship across time is something important in translation. But also, very often, the relationship that translation makes is in spaces. And so what we're talking about, I think, the examples that we've had so far, they're to do with the kind of relationship that happens when you translate. So this idea of the impossibility of translation, I think, is something, we're all familiar with those arguments. But if we think about the act of translation, it is a relationship. You're making, whatever it is, you're making some kind of relationship. And what's important is the space in which that translation is going to be read, its reception. And so this idea about sort of how those relationships come about, I think, is an interesting one, because you mentioned in your, I think in your opening, this idea that it can be a very personal language, that it's, when we translate, the language I really know to translate from is French, but when I'm translating a poem in French, it's not French to English, but it's the language of that particular writer into my language, my poetry language, because I have to make a poem out of what I've read. And so it's a relationship with two kinds of poetries, maybe ideas about poetry. What's the idea of poetry in the receiving culture? Is it going to be changed by the translation? And that's the really exciting thing. I think that's why we translate, because we want to bring something into our culture. And it's been great talking to poets here translating into Malayalam, and the range of kind of world authors that people here knows so well, and that through translation it's a kind of opening to the world. but it's because of a need in this, in this culture, in every culture, to find what it wants from elsewhere and bring it in. But it's individuals doing that and choosing works to translate and bringing them in. And this can result also in quite interesting maps. And so, where would you think somebody in Kerala, might have a particular interest in another poetry? And we discover that there are people here who, for example, really know Chilean poetry, for example. And, that's because of historical connections, relationships, friendships that sort of forged over time that are, making, particular places, particular writers important to this moment. And so in this way, I think translation can really shape the world that we live in as writers. And, and that's, it's really changing something. It's changing the cultural landscape. And this is why it's exciting. You find something you love, you bring it into a different language, and it's going to do something different. And also, as Meena said, English, of course, has these particular problems. It's kind of gone everywhere and kind of, as you say, sort of flattened cultural spaces in some ways. And so, and this is a problem really for everybody, and also of people whose first language is English. And so what do we do with those histories of colonization when we think about translation? Because sometimes English is giving you the idea that you can move very smoothly from one place to another, that everything is available to you. And poetry is a more complex space, and we always find something new and fascinating and a depth of language in translation. And it makes that space for something else to exist, and for English to be also challenged. And another reason why Meena's book's very exciting. So, thank you.
Translating the hot air into cool is very much loud. Like, it is very difficult to listen with this sound. Anyway, in the morning I was attended another session in the audience. Mamangdai was the center of that, about his works. And in between the discussion of his fiction and poetry, he just mentioned about their language, Adi. There is no word for time in Adi language. We startled for a moment. There is no word for time in that language. And after that session, we asked her, and it's wonderful that the concept of time is very much different from our kind of modernism and things like that. So how can they translate the world of time into their language? It's a basic question for all of us. It was I can't forget it the whole my life. I think that there is no time at all in particular language for time. There is no word for time. See, I come to the point. I think for me, translating poetry is writing poetry itself. That I experienced from my college, my academic. That when I was an MPhil student, there was a workshop in MG University. I think he was also there. In that workshop, there are 3 South Indian languages: Kannada, Malayalam, and Tamil, I think. And we have so many engagements with interactive engagements. Try 3 languages sit together, 2 languages sit together. See, English used as a bridge language only. In India, the English should be there as bridge language. But after a while, started the process of translation. gradually the bridge has disappeared. And we can communicate very easily. So when you use the bridge, you can walk from here to there and there to here casually. After a while, you can communicate the poem, the basic content of the poem. Then you started communicate with the poetry. Then you can translate from Kannada to Malayalam without knowing the language of discourse. The language of discourse is secondary. Then we started thinking in the language of poetry. So in the ideal case, the poets should sit together and translate. And I come back to that point, and I will give an example. I remember it was not a famous poem, but I remember that particular lines just because of the possibility of the similarity of language of poetry while translating. In a Kannada poem, the title of the Kannada poem was Basavana Hulu. That means Basava Pulu in Malayalam. Visitra Suruli Yolagina Jivadhi Jivave Ninna Ninabundu Vashakalada Tumba. This is the Kannada line. This is Kannada. Vijitra Churuli Nullile Jivande Jivane Ninna Matram Ninappu Varshakalangalilella. Visitra Suruli Yolagina Jivadhi Jivave. Vijitra Churuli Nullile Jivande Jivane. Even the sound pattern, the alliteration and the meter, everything is the same. Visitra Suruli Yolagi Jivadhi Ninna Ninapundu Varshakalada Tumba. Ninne matram ninappu varshakalangalilella. See, this kind of possibilities is very much fantastic to enter into the sound system of the closer languages. When the language is being distanced, it is more difficult. It's a technical thing. But the moment when you enter into the poem in between, the communication in between the poet translators started, there is no barrier of language. From Mappa or in Malayalam, in any language. So it's a political act should be the basic political act of writing poetry in nowadays, in the dark days of right-wing, the neoliberal kind of right-wing politics. You should resist that politics only through translation. In India, it is very much important to translate each other. That should be the louder political act and also in the whole world it is possible, and we can think about translation workshops than festivals. That is my opinion sometimes. And if there is time, we can talk later again some points also.
Yeah, what Anwar had given examples from Kannada and Malayalam. And the translations sounded very much like the original. Also mainly because these languages have a kind of kinship. And a lot of words can be used almost as they were in the original. But that may not be the case with all the languages. What I'm driving at is that the relationship between two languages also matters a lot when you translate from one language into another. See, there are quite a few languages which have Latin roots, whose words have Latin roots, and translating from one of those languages into another language in the same family may be much easier than translating from, say, Spanish into a Dravidian language like Malayalam. It's not easy because we have all tried that because I use bilingual text when I translate Spanish poetry into Malayalam. I have Spanish before me, which I don't understand completely. I then use an English translation, and then I also get the help of somebody who knows the original language, and then we sit to, I make a draft, I compare my translation with the original with the help of the Spanish scholar, and this is how I have done a lot of Spanish poetry. I have done from other languages too, mostly like this, getting assistance from a scholar who knows the original language. And comparing my draft with, sitting with him, comparing my draft with the original, because the languages have different kinds of music. They have different, even syntactical differences. There's a difference of syntax, you know. I have translated a lot of poetry from Hindi, by the way, directly, and the major difficulty I experience is one of syntax. the order of subject, object, and verb is very different in Hindi. And similarly, gender. In Malayalam, we have a masculine gender, we have a feminine gender, and we have also a neutral gender. But nothing is neutral in Hindi. Everything is either masculine or feminine, and sometimes what is feminine in Hindi might be, in our imagination, it may be something masculine. So there are very microscopic, extremely minute issues involved in translation when it comes to the actual vocabulary and the actual act of translation. I've always believed, like Gayatri Spivak, that the translation is perhaps a kind of intimate reading. So the translator, it is like watching a master painter at work, like a student of painting, watching a master painter, how the hand moves, how the imagination works, how the colors are chosen, how the various color zones are formed on the canvas. And from all these, you learn a lot about how a painting is ultimately made. And when you read a poem, it is not like just reading a poem. A translator's reading of a poem is a little different from a reader's reading, a casual reading of a poem, because you are also trying to move along with the poet. You are trying to see the ways through which the imagination of the original poet moves. You are trying to see the different ways in which words are combined, the original ways in which images suddenly appear in the original poem. And so it is really a kind of very intimate reading. And as Anwar very well said, you are also writing your poetry when you are translating. Translation is a form of writing, because you cannot actually translate the poem as it is. At the most, you can produce an echo. Again, I remember Walter Benjamin, saying, it is like calling from the periphery into the center of a forest, and then waiting for the echo. So you are calling into a forest, and so the translation is like an echo of the original. So there is something of the original in the translation, but it is not exactly the original itself. So it's impossible to copy a poem, in translation. You are not copying it. You are actually creating a poem of your own. And you also bring some of your, as Meena said, of course, we will try to keep our own imagination of the act of translation, but it can't be done beyond a point. Because somehow our imagination works, the way in which we combine words, the way in which we look at images, the way in which we read and appreciate poetry, all these also directly or indirectly influence the way in which we translate poetry. I took a lot of time maybe. So what the second question I wanted to ask was, do you consider translation an act of freedom? I mean, in the sense in which, for example, when I am translating from English into a language like Malayalam, actually I am translating from a colonizer's language into the language of the colonized. And so there is a kind of power at play in translation. It does not happen perhaps between languages which are equal, but when there is a dominant language, perhaps Hindi is also becoming a dominant language in India these days. And when you translate from Hindi into Malayalam or from English into Malayalam, you feel the pressure of a master language or a master upon your translation. And there is a kind of power play happening in the course of translation. Have you ever felt like that when you translate from any of the languages?
Yes, I think it's really important to resist that power and resist normalizing the text. So for me, it's very important to keep that sense of it being something foreign and something unknown. And so what I like to do is kind of play a little bit where I'm giving something known, but I give it to you with something unknown, so that you're always reminded that you're reading something that is outside of you. It's something other. And I think this is something we need to highlight, because the temptation and the way the language is to bring it into like normalized English, to use like idiomatic sentences that already exist. But I think it's important to remind the reader that it's something different. And we have, for example, in the case of Mepa, it's not a standardized language. There are no scholars, or there's very few linguists who are starting to do the work of explaining how the grammar works. It's a tonal language, so there's like rising, falling, neutral tones, and this music is used in the poem itself. And so, as a translator, I have to find a way to bring all of this into English, make it so that people can understand what it says, but without making it normal and without giving in to that temptation of power. I think it's very important to resist.
This question of freedom, at this point, like today, from where we stand, in some ways, when you write in English, as a poet who writes in English or a novelist who writes in English, it's seen as this place where you can be absolutely sexually liberated, you can be very subversive, you can express. Because, I mean, speaking from the very vantage point of the 21st century, like, you know, you write whatever and you're like, oh, people are going to be fine with it. I mean, as if I was writing this in Tamil, it would be controversial. In English, I can say what I want. But this is like such a, it's something that's existed only now, because when you go back to translation of something like Thirukural, and this is like 200 years ago, the first translations come, and in Tamil, it's called the Kamathupal, basically the book of sex, or the book of, if you want to be polite, the book of desire. And Kamam, even today in Tamil, means sex. It means, you know, a very physical lust, physical desire. But all the translations that took place in the earlier colonial era, or when it was, whether it was, you know, Christian missionaries who were doing it, it was British officials in India who were doing it, or it was, you know, Hindu reformists who were doing it, they were using a kind of English which referred to the feelings of sexual desire, feelings of physical longing. They were using words like union. They were using words like Congress. So it was the same English, but because of the cultural mores into which English at that time operated. So where was the freedom? Like, you know, and that's the question is, how do you reclaim this freedom? Because absolutely, like the English of today, you know, that's why a translation becomes important as we go through time as well. Because the English of that day did not allow for this expression. It's the English of today that allows you to, you know, be as explicit as Thiruvalluvar was all those years ago. And I also think, you know, like somehow the part of this is where I think decolonization, or, you know, the colonial language and the colonized language comes so much into play. Because I personally think, and I very strongly argue, that colonialism in India did not necessarily start with the arrival of the British or the Dutch or whoever. Because I think internal colonialization happened to our languages. The hegemony of Sanskrit, or the trying to impose Hindi. I mean, all of these are colonialisms. They might be minor, they may be by people who are not necessarily white-skinned, but these are colonialisms that we have to look into our language. And this is where I think the Thirukural is a very interesting and fascinating text, because when you look at the Thirukural, a lot of the understanding is that these are poems from the husband to the wife, or these are poems from the wife to the husband, so these are poems of chaste married love. But you realize that these meanings started coming only around the 12th century. These meanings started coming, these were called, what do you call, they say urai or commentary. And these commentators were largely, you know, Sanskrit influenced Brahmins who were writing the commentary. So at this point, the text itself doesn't hold these ideas, but the commentary starts to introduce these ideas. So for instance, when Valluvar speaks about, you know, a woman's unwavering mind, or nirai, it becomes, in the commentary it's written, chastity which is dearer than life. But this is not there in the original text. And this is what I think freedom means, to take back the text, from these kinds of misplaced patriarchal readings, to take it back from, you know, where it's held hostage, and to say, okay, let it breathe, let it be free.
Can I ask one more question to Meena? Of course, we'll come to you. You know, I remember, you know, Dilip Chitre, while translating Tukaram, saying that, you know, he had to imagine Tukaram's time. He had, in some sense, to recreate the age in which Tukaram originally wrote. At the same time, to a contemporary reader, the translation should sound contemporary. It should look like modern poetry written today. At the same time, he should also give this feeling that, well, this was written somewhere, maybe in the 14th century or so. So while translating Tirukural, did you have this kind of a problem? It shouldn't look like a very modern text. At the same time, a modern reader has to appreciate that as part of the, the contemporary contemporary poetry. I mean, the geography of contemporary poetry.
So when I translated the Tirukural, part of me was like, there are two answers to it. I'll be very brief and quick. I want the others to speak as well. So the first part of the answer is that my version of the Tirukural is perfect for sexting. 280 characters. It's really brilliant. So is it contemporary? Yes. And also when you read the Tirukural, it's never said a man speaks this. It never said it's spoken to a woman. So it can be a woman speaking to a woman, it can be a man speaking to a man. So if a woman is being described as beautiful, it could be a girl saying she's beautiful. It could be a woman saying she's beautiful. So for me, when I did this translation, it became this really, it was almost like querying the text, because everybody assumed it was a man speaking to a woman, but it necessarily doesn't have to be. So, or there are scenes where the wife fights, she says, all the women in the world are looking at you, so I'm not going to embrace you. But the thing is, it could be a gay lover saying to him, or it could be a bisexual person saying to their partner, I'm not going to embrace you because everyone is after you. I mean, this kind of petty jealousy transcends gender. So I wanted to leave the text in that very open moment, because it's not me imposing, the text was like that. And part of this is also trying to make it contemporary, was also, how do you imagine what the system of marriage looked like 2000 years ago? Because this is a book about love, it's not a book about marriage, right? So for me it was, what if Valluvar was writing these poems for his side chick? Or what if she was writing these poems for him? So in some way, I think this contemporary element for me became like, it was not imposed, but there are things that you cannot translate. I mean, like if a man is saying, oh, your feet is soft like petals, or he says, but some things never change, Satchidanandan. So this guy says, Pandariyen Kootru enbadanai ini arindhen pendagayal perumarkattu. He says, I never known what is death. And then I see this in this woman's eyes. And I think Tamil men haven't changed in 2000 years. They're still saying, oh, you intimidate me, therefore you turn me on.
Should you answer the earlier question, or should we go to something different? Do you have something to say about it?
Yes. Just very briefly, because I live in Wales, where there are two languages, and so Welsh is very, very different from English. And I'm not first language Welsh, and it's not a language that I translate. So what you're saying about translating between languages in a place, actually in Wales it's a bit more complicated, because sometimes translation isn't a freedom, and the experience sometimes of people who have a lesser spoken language is if everything is translated, then there's no space for that language. And so in Wales, I think sometimes my job is not with poetry, is to listen rather than to translate. And sometimes to this. So Welsh poetry has a very ancient tradition, poetry in Welsh, and it's extremely intricate, and and people of course argue that that's untranslatable, but it's also making this particular sound, and we've talked a little bit about sound too. Yes. Strict meter, yes. And so there are arguments sometimes for freedom, for not translating, but for listening to a language. And I find that that's something that I've got interested in, is the sound of other languages. And that's found its way into my own poetry, where sometimes I use words in other languages without translating them. And so it's another way around that question.
Briefly, I will say, I have a connection with Welsh poetry also, but I now translate Paul Henry, but he's writing in English, but still it is very, very, very much different from the original English writer. I cannot translate Shema Heaney, but I can easily communicate with Paul. That I don't know. I think this the hierarchy of language works in history also. The politeness of language, the microcultural elements of the language and things like that. See, it is a very different culture. Welsh, Kerala is Malayalam is a very different part of the world. But see, still I can communicate more than an English poet to the Welsh poet. See, and another point I want to mention briefly that see, when you go through the English anthologies of the other languages. For example, I have an experience with the Korean poetry. There is a big, a good anthology of modern Korean poetry published by Pennsylvania University. And I happened to engage in with Korean poets to translate in a residency. And then only I understand that these English versions are too much purified. Too much purified for the Western and American readers. For example, there are some poems connected with agrarian culture, and in the agrarian culture, so many elements of drinks and food and so many agricultural activities, they reduced into the universal kind of words. For example, say they use makoli. Makoli is a drink. It's like our color. But in the English translation, they use alcohol or drink, like that words. But then I sit with the poets and translate with the help of the English version to understand the basic text. Then the Malayalam version is very different when you mix. So the hierarchy works in the publishing industry more than in between poets. That's the main point. In between poets, I think we can vanish the difference of hierarchies and colonial kind of relations when you sit together. I want to explain more, but not time at all.
I have also been to two Welsh workshops where we translated one another, the Welsh poets and poets from some other languages, not only Malayalam. And I have always also felt a kind of anger in the Welsh people against the hegemony, the domination of English, and how English almost silenced and drowned a language like Welsh. So these things also sometimes work in when you think about translation. And Anwar of course raised a very important issue when he spoke about the universalization of specific cultural elements. This is of course this is a regular issue in translation. Because there are certain things which will probably stay only in the language, certain things which are very specific to the particular language. But when you translate, especially into a language like English, which is supposed to be, universal, whether it is actually the universal language is another question. But it is supposed to be a universal language, international language. Then you internationalize something which was your own, something which was very, very, very personal, deeply culturally specific. So there is a loss of the specificity of culture in some translation. And again, Anwar made there was another point that you made without making. That is, if you translate from a small language into another small language, maybe you will be able to capture those nuances and those specificities better than when you translate from a small language into a very large language, because it is meant to be understood across the world. And so you have to make a kind of compromise, and you have to make what was particular something general. So, and that leads to the loss of the specific genius of that language and the specific character of that particular culture. Of course, that is of course a deeper problem which we need to probe, which we cannot do in this session itself. I would now like to ask a very, very general question. Why do you translate poetry at all? You can translate poetry for various reasons. You can translate it for aesthetic reasons. For example, you are introducing some new kind of sensibility into your we all did that in the 1960s and early 70s. We translated a lot of poets to tell our poets that this is how poetry is written in other languages, and it indeed inspired a lot of avant-garde poetry in the 60s and the 70s. Our poetry changed. And in that transformation, translations did play a role. It happened in the 60s, when we translated, T.S. Eliot and Auden and quite a lot of other poets from the United States and England. It happened again in the 70s when we translated Pablo Neruda or Nicanor Parra and many of the poets who were essentially left of center in politics. And it is again happening in the 80s and the 90s, introducing younger poets from different languages of the world, which also keeps influencing your own poetry, the poetry in your own language, and creating a new kind of avant-garde. So there can be a political reason for translation, there can be a cultural or an aesthetic reason for translation, or there can also be a very, very personal reason, because you feel some poet to be almost speaking for you. Emotionally, you feel a kind of identity with that particular poet, and so you feel like translating. So I would like each of you to take, we don't have much time, to take a little time and say, perhaps all these come into your translation, but what is the dominant element that that makes you a translator, that forces you, compels you to translate poetry at all? Because we can spend all our time in writing our own poetry. Instead, why do we also translate poetry at all? Is it to introduce your language to other languages? Is it for a cultural reason, or is it for an aesthetic reason, to introduce a new sensibility, or to create a new language and a new idiom, or is it for political reasons? Because, for example, when you translate a strong feminist poetry, when feminism is coming up in India, it is also to empower women. It is not purely to create to introduce a new kind of poetry. So would you?
Okay, briefly, the answer to that multiple choice question is all of the above. So, my answer is all of the above, because you listed out everything. But I think the main impetus is actually kind of to say, when you think of classics in a whatever quote unquote global stage, you always think of Greek and Latin, right? Like the fact that Tamils were making work such a long time ago, I think it was important at some point to take that space. But also, I think in general, to dismantle aesthetics, because there's a certain type, especially in, like when I was in the US, you understand that every poem is so heavily workshopped. And they're often about, cats or loneliness or going to the salon. So it's like a certain there are very limited tropes. And then you're like, no, people are writing poetry about other things. So I think in some ways it's to infuse fresh blood into another language. So that's what I think. So.
For me, it's a sense of very strong urgency that kind of takes over me. And it's almost like a physical thing. Like I have to share this with other people because the message has spoken to me so strongly that I cannot not translate it. And to me, this urgency can be partly political, as is with the case of translating Mexican poets writing in indigenous language, because in Mexico, the indigenous languages have been systematically suppressed historically. Many of these languages are endangered. There is not the same kind of institutional support, etc. And so I feel like this is really valuable culture that we can learn from and that deserves to be known to other people. So for me, this is partly the sense of urgency. And then there's also the sensibility, how we view the world, how we view everything around us, relationships between people. There's always something that can be learned from this other culture, even though it's the culture within the same country, and it can be so different. So I feel like when this urgency takes over me, I just have to do it. And yeah, so definitely not for the money, let's say, because it's a labor of love.
Fortunately, poetry has very little to do with money, and that's why poetry has survived all kinds of capitalist onslaughts.
Yes, thank you. I started by talking about translation as a relationship, and in my case, yes, it's either a connection with a poet. Maybe I often translate contemporary poetry, or a sense of connection with the that also offers some kind of, yes, it's a kind of friendship, a friendship either with the person or the work or both, and yeah, wanting to explore that. Translation, reading, yeah. So if I want to read something in another language, I'm already translating, and so sometimes actually making a translation is just an extension of reading.
For me, translating poetry is an essential part of writing poetry. First, in the beginning of, in my young age, I have limitations of language. So I want to understand a poem in English. So for understanding poetry, you start translating it. While translating, you get into the technicalities of writing poetry and things like that. Then gradually it became an act of writing poetry. And see, I have a bad experience with the poetry. I included in my last collection, the first draft of the last collection, I included some of the major in quotes. For me, it's the major translation I have done. I included it as a third part of the book. And the editor in the office of the publisher told me, these days you have to fetch the copyright and things, and they will be in the problem. Then I avoided that portion. I'm very much sad that I avoided. And but I performed a poem by Adcock that I have done. I got the pleasure as much as write a long narrative poem while I translated, and all while I performed here, I got that energy. So translation is the very hello. It's the real act of writing poetry. All poets know this reality, I'm sure.
We don't have much time, but maybe we can take one question or so.
Good evening, sir. So, just a while back, you were saying that you were asking a question to your panelists, your fellow panelists. Why would we be taking the pain of translating poetry? We could all be writing our own poetry, but what's the motivation of translating? So, sir, shall we assume that the act of writing poetry would be more fulfilling to a poet than the act of translating poetry? Which one is more fulfilling to you as a writer? Is it the act of writing poetry, your own poetry, or the act of translating another poetry, which gives the maximum satisfaction or fulfillment as a writer?
Well, this is for everybody to answer, but for me, of course, the first thing is my own poetry for me. But then I translate somebody else's poetry also when I feel that that is a kind of extension of my poetry. I consider my translations to be a part of my entire poetic oeuvre. I mean, it's also a part of the poetic world I have created. It's not only my own poems, but all these translated poems together have contributed to the world of poetry that I have created, and I may leave when I leave the world.
Yes, yes. Similarly, yes, there's a connection between the two activities, and I would say that also when I'm writing my own poetry, it's also got lots of connections with my reading and other texts, and I think that writing poetry is also a conversation with other writers, texts, poems. Yeah, so you're never really, yes, it's maybe never really your own. Yeah.
Thank
Session
you.
is over. That's all. I already answered the question.
So,
Without.
thank you, Mr. Anwar Ali, Juana Adcock, Zoë Skoulding, Meena Kandasamy, and
Thank
K.
you.
Satchidanandan.